G, U, A, no, G, A, U, no, G, U, O, Today we're going to take a look at the Winsor & Newton Designer's Gouache 6-tube primary color set. Also, how to spell gouache. Hi folks, I'm Chris, and if you're new here, welcome to French Loanwords 101. I have a tendency to use my gouache like watercolor and my watercolor like gouache, so when I saw this set, I thought maybe I should try using my gouache like gouache. Novel, I know. I have used a few other brands of gouache, just not the Winsor & Newton, so whatever we find testing today is going to be as much a surprise to me as it is to you. This set contains 6 half-ounce tubes of gouache in primary red, primary yellow, permanent green middle, primary blue, ivory black, and zinc white. Let's get swatching. I'm using hot pressed watercolor paper here because it's low texture, so any texture that we see is going to be entirely due to the paint. Okay, but why is this white so fibrous? I've never seen paint do that. I'm not sure the video really does justice to the stringiness. Off camera I tried different brushes to make sure it wasn't just my brush losing its bristles into the paint, but it was like this with all of them. These paints are opaque enough that doing a gradient with just water is difficult. There's no real smell that I'm noticing, and it conforms to the American Society for Testing Materials, or ASTM, D4236, which means it's properly labeled if there's any chronic health hazard. These particular colors don't have any warnings, but some of the other colors in the line do. However, the paint does contain MBIT, a preservative, which is not uncommon in water-based paint. It can cause an allergic reaction, but otherwise shouldn't be a problem as long as you don't, lick the paint or inhale paint powder. They do suggest immediately washing it off if you have skin contact. Now this may sound alarming, but it's all pretty standard with water-based paints. As with all paint, make sure you wash your hands well before eating anything, and that you don't get any spatters of it in your drink. And always work in a well-ventilated room. Even though it doesn't have a noticeable smell, it does still have the capacity to produce a fume, and it's best not to be breathing that. What I'm finding is that each color seems to have a subtly different consistency. The yellow and green spread more evenly, where the blue and red need a little extra water to make them even. I will have to buy another box to see if this is related to the different pigments and it's the same across each color, or if it's an inconsistency in the paints in general. I'm also going to layer some colors here. Because these are water-based, the more water you use, the more likely it is to lift the layer below. So glazing is difficult, it's more mixing than layering, but if you use undiluted paint or just enough water to make it smooth, you can usually go over the lower layers. And this is how it looks when it's dry. Gouache dries more matte than watercolor or acrylic generally. Let's try mixing them. This is a good selection of colors to mix from. The red is cool, so it will be difficult to get a warm purple, but the mixed colors are vibrant and rich, not muddy. Even the muddy browns I mixed to use as literal mud in the painting are well defined and feel intentional. Making gradients from one color to the next is easier if you mix it on your palette instead of trying to do it with water on the page. This is how it blends into a color wheel. I don't find gouache as easy to use with other media as watercolor is. I've made a matrix here to show you how it combines with other media. I used pencil, colored pencil, watercolor pencil, watercolor, waterproof ink, chalk pastels, and oil pastels. For all of the dry media, the overpainting is opaque and the underpainting has a lot of texture, which makes the blending and layering further difficult. If you're taking advantage of that texture for effect, that's fine, but for general use, you may want to avoid it. The chalk specifically became very gummy. For all the wet media, painting over is still opaque, but when the gouache paint is what's underneath, the wetness of the layer above it reactivates the paint, and you end up mixing the colors instead of layering them. In all of these cases, the opaqueness depends on the color. For instance, the yellow is less opaque than the green, as you can see here. And for my last test, I pulled out two other types of paper, some cold press watercolor and some black paper. You can see if you want to work on a dark background that this is the paint you want. It's just as vibrant on the black paper as the white, even diluted down to a wash. It's still visible. Gouache's history is a little mixed up. If you search it up online, you'll see people saying that it started in prehistoric cave paintings, that it started with the Egyptians using it on papyrus, it started in the medieval era with manuscript illuminations, or it started in its modern form in the 18th century. Now, within their own context, all of these assertions are correct. That's because it's kind of a catch-all term for any opaque, water-based paint. Which one is correct depends on how strictly you interpret its components. In modern use, gouache is basically watercolor, so pigment plus gum arabic, with a filler, usually white pigment to make it opaque, and gouache may contain more pigment by percentage than regular watercolors. But even with today's paint, you can't categorize it then strictly based on binder. There's rosin, aka gum arabic, and some gouaches use a starch-based glue called yellow dextrin. And now there's even acrylic gouache, which uses acrylic polymers, that's plastic, as a binder. The name is equally as broad as the definition. Wiktionary says gouache is a French term borrowed from the Italian guazzo. Now, every place I checked looking for a proper translation of the word guazzo gave me something different, but they all pertain to water. If you speak Italian, please feel free to give it a proper definition in the comments. My favorite translation came from Google Translate's dictionary. I will never be able to look at brown gouache the same way again. Circling back around to the spelling, that's why it's spelled so differently from most English words. French Frenchified the Italian spelling, and then English mugged French as it was coming out of the art shop and anglicized the sound. I kind of want to only pronounce it like the Italian now, for spite. Guazzo! Okay, Back to the review. The experience of painting with gouache is much more intense for me than watercolor. I had to keep getting up and moving around to let off some energy and to remind myself to breathe. You can build up some fantastic texture with gouache, but that also has a downside. If you build up the paint too thick, then it can cause cracking due to the layers drying at different times. And if this one is still wet and you put another one over the top that dries faster, then as this one dries, the one on top will crack. The color changes slightly as it dries. This is probably the biggest challenge with gouache compared to other media because you have to accommodate that and anticipate it while you're painting. The brushes require extensive cleaning between colors. If you're using the paint thick, I suggest using multiple brushes so that you don't have to stop every few minutes to clean them. Speaking of brushes, make sure to clean your brushes twice. You will think looking at them that you have got them completely clean, but then when you blot them on a paper towel, you'll see that there's still a residue of the green or the black that's there, and so you will need to go back and wash them a second time to get all of the pigment out. I ended up having to double wash every brush that I used with this set. Gouache dries very quickly, not just on the page, but in the palette too. Because it's water-based, you can technically re-wet the paint in the palette to keep using it, but be aware that it will not have the same consistency as paint fresh out of the tube, even diluted paint out of the tube. It'll be much more like working with regular watercolors at that point, though the final product will still be more opaque. Underpainting with gouache can add extra depth to your image, but because it will lift with water, if you underpaint, you have to manage the wetness of your layers much more carefully. I chose not to underpaint on the painting I did here so that I could show varying degrees of wetness in the paint, but underpainting with gouache is very common. Light fastness is different per pigment. I would be comfortable using these in a painting to sell, but you will have to check each color individually before using it. Winsor & Newton helpfully has a table of light fastness and chemical composition of every paint on their website. It's very handy. I wish every paint company did this. They also have a helpful guide on how to read their labels. I will link both in the description. Okay, but is it worth the cost? This is both a yes and a no. The MSRP for this set is over $60. I don't think I would pay $60 for the set, even though they are of very high quality. However, on Blick and Amazon, it sells for about half of that at $30, and that is a much more reasonable price for this set. It's cheapest on Amazon, but I don't buy my art supplies from Amazon anymore because it's too easy to get dried out or broken or even counterfeit. I've received counterfeit products from Amazon and you just never know what you're going to get ahead of time. I would suggest your local art shop first, but if you can't find it there, I will leave a link in the description to the listing on Blick. Importantly, you can buy the individual tubes open stock. The list cost is pretty steep. They're $12 to $30, but like with the box, Blick carries them at almost half the price, from about $6 to $14, depending on the pigment and tube size. I think overall, the price is the only thing that I'm going to take a point off for. That MSRP is ridiculous for the average artist. To be clear, I do think that they are worth the price. I think that they are very high quality. Pigment is expensive, and there's more pigment in gouache than watercolor, so you expect those prices to be slightly higher. And this is very high quality. Winsor & Newton is a prestige brand. So, if you can afford it, go for it, but it's going to be out of the budget for the average artist if they want to work at a medium or a large scale. So long as it remains available at about half the MSRP, I will continue buying them. But if it ever goes back up to the full list price, and that's all I can get it at, I will probably have to find cheaper alternatives. So my final tally is 9 sunflower seeds out of 10. If you've enjoyed this review, give gouache a go and share your experience with it in the comments. And if you could like and subscribe, that would be fantastic too. And if you really liked this review, a link to my Discord and my Patreon are also in the description below. Massive thank you to my patrons. I say that every time, and it's always true. I really couldn't do this without you. I will also leave a link to the Winsor & Newton Designer's Gouache 6-tube set in the description if you would like to try it out for yourself. I'll be back with another video as quickly as I can. Till then, happy creating. Let's get squatching. Let's get squatching. Permanent metal permanent. If it ever,